welcome to Krazy Fluid Art. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I create on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those emerging. As I always say, it is my absolute pleasure to be able to create on the land that they once lived on. So today's video is all about straight lines. I get asked all the time about straight lines and how I get my straight lines with my resin work. So today I'm going to go through all the steps from go to woe, from the starting of my board prep to the finishing of my resin work. So you can get an idea on how I do my boards. Hopefully you find it enlightening and watch to the end. Alright, so this is my first stage of board prep. Now I am playing this video at fast speed because it's basically a repeat 3 times over. I do this for every single board I paint. So I use green frog tape instead of blue frog tape, which is what we have here in Australia because I find it's better quality tape. I tape a ledge on the front of my board, which is where I want the paint to end, so then I can nice straight line. And then I go through and I tape the edges, but I only tape half of the edge. I want my paint to drop half of the board, but not the full length of the edge of the board. And the reasoning why I do that is because I found when I first was doing painting boards that I was letting the paint drip the whole edge, and then I'd go and resin it when it was cured. And I found that at the base of the board, the resin had nothing to grip onto. So when I was pulling the tape off, sometimes the resin would actually lift and I'd end up with these gaps. So I now only do a half board paint so that when I go and resin, the resin then drops the whole, covers that half bit of paint and then continues on down to the board and forms this really nice seal. I also find that actually look really, really cool. So I've just finished one board there. So I'm repeating the same process again on my next board. I usually have a day where I prepare boards, and I usually do 12 to 15 boards in one day, varying shapes and sizes, so that I've always got boards available and ready to go if I need to paint a certain size without having to worry about doing individual preps here and there or ad hoc preps. So as you see, I'm just doing little bits at a time. Most of my boards have little holes in them that people use to hang their boards with. I like to keep my holes. If the board comes with a hole, I will keep it. So when I'm doing my frog taping, like this point here, when I tape down across a hole, I will cut that hole out with each individual piece of tape. I won't layer the tape and then cut it all out in one go because I find it's actually harder to cut through several layers of tape. So I usually will just do one layer of tape, cut a hole, fold over the next layer of tape, cut a hole, just because it's easier with the Stanley knife. There have been times where I have forgotten to cut the hole and I've gone and resined, and it just basically means the resin just forms a seal and then there's no hole. So I like to get my Stanley and cut a hole because I feel like that gives you a point for your resin to drip through, and it then gives something for your clients to hang their boards with if that's what they decide to do at home to display them. So you should see here I've got 3 of the same size boards. These are my small boards, but I've done the taping different on each. I've done angles different, I've done a straight line, but the practice itself is all the same. They get the front taping done. This board here obviously needed a clean for some reason, and then I tape the sides by half right around the edges. Then what I sometimes do, which I haven't done in this video, I might do it in the next video, I can't remember, is I glad wrap the base, or I use some alfoil or a plastic bag on the base and tape that around. So that just keeps the edge that I'm not painting clean, so that when I'm moving the board around with my dirty painty gloved hands, I'm not transferring paint onto the area that then's going to have to need a clean. So it's just another way of making the boards easier to work with. So at the moment I'm just doing small boards, but I will go ahead and I'll end up doing medium, large and my extra large boards, and I just have them stored on a shelf, all prepped, ready to go, so that if I decide that, oh, I've sold 3 or 4 boards this weekend at a market, then I've got boards already prepped that I can go and start painting. or if I have a client saying, look, I'd really like this board, I'm like, yep, I've probably got some prepped. It means I just don't have to do those individual ad hoc prepping. So after I have done all my taping of all my boards, I then do a layer of gesso over the area that I'm going to paint. So the reason why I use gesso is because I find it's a great sealant for putting a little bit of a barrier between your paint and the board. I have had some boards where the wood's actually seeped through, especially if I'm using white paint. I've had some boards turn that white pillow paint that I use into a light brown because it's just transferred. So by adding a coat of gesso, it kind of prevents that from happening. It also helps sometimes at the end when I'm resining, preventing some of those what I call wooden bubbles. I don't know if that's what they're called, but that's what I call them, popping through as well, because you've got that nice sealant. There are different sealants you can use. Some people use some spray stuff. I just like gesso because I find it's really easy to use and I can see where I've used it. So as you can see here, I've got my green tape line. The good thing about having that nice tape line is that I can gesso over, I can paint over it, because when that paint's just dried, I will then peel that tape off once I've finished painting the design, and then I'll have this really nice straight line of my painting on my board. And then in the next video down the track, I show you how to keep that straight line when you're doing your resin. So now on to the next stage of prepping my boards. These two particular boards that I'm using for the example today have already had a coat of resin, but due to some issues on the boards, one had a couple of holes in it, I have to re-resin. But it's the same process as to whether I'm doing my first coat of resin or my second coat of resin in my board preparation. The only difference between the two is if I'm applying a second coat of resin, I need to sand back the first coat a little bit, A, to give something for the resin to stick to, but B, also as an opportunity to get rid of the imperfections that I am trying to remove. So here I am taping my board. It's pretty much the same process as taping for my board prep for painting, but the only difference is I'm not taping the sides of my board when I'm resining, because I want that resin to drip down the whole edge of the board. The really important thing with this part of the taping process is I need that tape to be nice and flush with the side of the board. I really need it to be on the edge. You don't want it to be hanging over the edge, otherwise your resin's going to form a pool, and you don't want it to be too short so that the resin drips over onto the board. And this is how I get my straight lines. So the same thing for the front of the board when I'm painting is I throw a bit of resin, a bit of tape with about 5 mil of board between the painting, where the painting ends and where the tape begins. And so then that way, it doesn't matter when I'm resining that I put resin on the green tape, because again, in a later video, I show you how to remove the tape before the resin cures. But this gives just that little bit of board between the paint and the tape for the resin to sit. And it's a game changer if you're trying to get straight lines on your board. It just makes all the difference. So again, you'll see here this has already been a resined board, but we do a nice straight taping line. I might just, the other thing now that I do before I sand the board is I actually get some Liquitex Gloss Medium and I paint around the edges between the tape and the board. And what that does is it forms a little bit of a seal from the board to the tape to try and prevent that resin. Sometimes the resin seeps in underneath the board, underneath the tape, and forms a bit of a thing. And I do it with the front and I do it with the back. With the sides. So right along the sides, I form a bit of a seal with some Liquitex Gloss Medium and I let it dry. And that just helps form a seal, as I said earlier, between the resin and the tape and the board. So that sometimes what can happen is the resin seeps underneath. So I flip it over and I do the same between the painting and that tiny little bit of wood that I've got there of the board. Get some Liquitex Gloss Medium and form a seal. And again, that's another way of making sure that the resin just seeps over the top and not underneath the tape. It's an absolute game changer and makes your life a lot easier. So as I said, this is my second coat of resin that I'm applying today. So I'm just giving the board a light sand to get rid of any of those imperfections that I'm trying to remove. And then I will clean it with some 99% isopropyl alcohol to remove any of that sanding grit that's been left behind. Also to remove any of my hand oil, otherwise the resin's not going to stick and I'm going to have to do a third coat of resin. But I do the same process if it's a first coat of resin. All items needing to be resin should be cleaned with some isopropyl alcohol before you go and resin, because you want to remove any oils, any dust, anything from that painted surface before you go and attach some resin. So the next video is where we get into the nitty gritties of hanging out with some resin. So our next important step, which I sort of semi, don't know if that's a word, but anyway, lightly touched on in the previous video, is our final part of board prep before we can resin is cleaning the board. So I use a 99% isopropyl alcohol, and I have found this is the best product that I have come across for cleaning my painting and my boards and my coasters and anything that I'm going to resin. I clean with my isopropyl alcohol. So I basically just cut up a couple of chuck swipes or cleaning cloths, depending on what country you're in, into little squares. I spray the area that I'm going to clean with my alcohol, and then I give it a good rub down. And I'm wearing gloves. It's really important to be wearing gloves because you don't want to be transferring any of the oil that you've got on your hands onto that surface that you've just cleaned, because if you transfer any oil, then that is a potential deterrent for resin. So that might be an area where resin actually moves away from, and then you end up with a hole without resin, and then you have to go do a second coat. So anything that I'm resining, so that's a wine caddy at the moment, I'm cleaning it exactly the same way that I'm cleaning my boards and my coasters, which don't have tape on them, but again, my coasters will go and get cleaned in exactly the same way. A spray of alcohol and a wipe down with my Chuck's wipe. And that is pretty much the last step that I do before I go and add my resin. So we're slowly getting there. Yoo-hoo, she says. All right, so here we are, ready to start resining. So I have my amazing filtered mask on. Even though the Stone Coat resin I use says it's a VOC-free resin, I still like to take additional precautions by wearing my filtered mask. I've only got one pair of lungs, so it's important. I have my silicone mat and my silicone cup, and I have drawn my lines that I've already pre-measured out so that my A and B resin are measured equally. Oh, and of course I haven't gotten everything organized because, you know, why would you make a video without having all your equipment in front of you? But there's my blowtorch that I use for my micro bubbles. And then I have my heat gun, which I use for my larger bubbles at the start. It's the very first gun I use, and to help move my resin around. Then once I've done that, then I go ahead and use my blowtorch to remove those micro bubbles. And watching those micro bubbles disappear it's so therapeutic. I have my stirring tool. So I used to stir by hand, and when you're stirring for 4 minutes, it's hard work. So I brought this battery operated tool that is a game changer. I just pop it in and I let it do its work. I have my Fluid Art Co stirring stick, which is great for applying the resin. What else do I need? I can't remember what else I'm grabbing now. My alcohol wipes to clean my equipment as I go. So I always have a few of those cleaning alcohol wipes ready to go, and my gloves. Gloves are really important. You do not want to get resin on your skin, and I always wear 2 pairs of gloves at a time. Purely because then because I resin with my hands, I don't resin with sticks. So once I finish resining that board, I can then pull off that top coat of gloves and then use the nice clean set of gloves to hold on to my heat gun and my blowtorch. And that's just another way of keeping my hands clean. And then finally, my picking sticks. You're going to need some picking sticks because you're going to end up with stuff in your resin, and it's the best way to pick it out. Otherwise, we're good. We're ready to go. Let's go get some resin work done. All right, so it's time to mix some resin. So in my cup here, I've got equal parts of A and B resin. And now I am just using my battery operated stirring stick, and this is really fast, to mix my resin. So you'll see here now it's quite cloudy, and that's how it starts. Once you start mixing your A and B resin together, it becomes cloudy. And then as the time ticks on and your resin starts to mix, that cloudiness disappears. Using this electric tool, I still do get micro bubbles, but I don't stress too much about the bubbles. I'm not going to go buy some fancy machine that gets rid of your bubbles, because that's what my heat gun and my blowtorch is for. So bubbles, it is what it is. You can put your heat gun in here to help pop some of those bubbles before you apply. I don't tend to do that very often. Every now and then I might, but this is it. So I usually go a minute clockwise, a minute anti-clockwise, and then alternate so that the resin's getting mixed around. I also drag it around the sides as well to pull all the resin off the sides. And then I go and clean my tool with my Fluid Art Co stirring stick. And then we're basically good and ready to go. So what we should have here is some nice clear resin. Yep, with probably some bubbles. This is also a really good reason why I have my alcohol cleaning cloths available, because I can go and clean my stirring stick straight away without it collecting dust, without the resin starting to do anything silly, because obviously resin has a short working time. And now we're good and ready. Yep, so now we're good and ready to go. So this video is going to be sped up because you don't need to watch me apply resin. I can save that for another video. But as you can see, I use my hands, which is why having gloves is so important, and double gloving it makes your life so much easier. So I pour my resin on, and then I get my hands in, and I like to massage my resin into every part of the board. And I feel, for me, that gives my boards the best chance of the resin sticking to every surface and not ending up with any imperfections. I go down and I rub my hands around the sides. I then blowtorch. So I'm also doing some coasters here at the same time, just to use up the little bits of resin. But I will then, once I've done my coat of resin, I blowtorch to get rid of some large bubbles. And then I get my my blowtorch. Sorry, I heat gun first, and then I get my blowtorch, and I pop all those little micro bubbles. And then I'll get a little picking stick, and I go through and just check in the light to see if there's anything worth picking out, like some hairs or a little bit of dust or something like that. And then what I usually do in the next couple of hours is every 20 minutes, half hour or so, I'll go through and maybe do another little light blowtorch just in case any bubbles or anything's popped up. And I do that for a couple of hours, and then I let it sit. So as you can see here, my hands are getting in and getting dirty. I don't mind going over the taped line because we're going to peel that off in about 6 hours. And that's really important. So I use, as I said, with the tape on the back and the tape on the front. If you leave that on while your resin's curing, and if you leave it on for too long, your resin will cure, and then getting that tape off is a biatch, and then you're going to have problems with a nice straight line. So at about 6 hours time, I will come back, pull my boards off the shelves, and we will remove the tape. And that's going to happen in the next video. It is really important. It's an important step that I've learnt. It's a great way of making sure that your tape doesn't stick to the board, especially at the back. I found that if I left it until the next day and pulled the tape off the next day, I left with all these pieces of tape stuck everywhere, and I'd have to go and sand or work out ways of removing the tape. So the next step is probably one of my most important steps that I take to remove the tape and to keep my lines nice and straight. And this is the step that everybody keeps asking me about, which is why I've made this video. So all these steps now are leading up to the next process. All right, so it's been about 6 hours since I did my resin earlier on today. So now we're going to go through the important step of removing my tape. So I've got my gloves on, I've got my apron, and I have my blowtorch. So the first step is you've got to be very careful, because obviously your resin's tacky. You want your resin to be tacky. You don't want your resin to be runny. So now what we do is we get the blowtorch on a low setting and we just lightly run it over the back where those resin strips are. Being careful because you do not want to burn your tape. If you burn your tape, then you're likely going to end up with a burn mark on the board. So it's just a light because you just want to see resin drips. See there where your resin's dripping, and that means you can peel your tape off your board. So we just lift it up very carefully. Sometimes we get really lucky and we can pull the tape off in one go, and sometimes we can't. So it's just dependent on the day. So we're just going to pull off all the black tape, and now I'm just going to give it a clean. There is a bit of resin dregs, so you can clean it a little bit with some isopropyl alcohol wipes. It doesn't always work, and the only thing you've got to be careful of is because you're using a cloth, you can end up with cloth dregs stuck to your board. And then we just lift these side panels up from the back because this is the front tape. We're going to pop our board down. We're going to get our blowtorch, and again, we're going to lightly blowtorch over. We do this to just soften that edge. And then we peel the tape towards the resin. If you peel the tape towards the board, any dregs of resin that come off might end up flipping onto the board. So by peeling it towards the resin, that stops that from happening. And then we give it a light little spray over to soften that resin to form a nice smooth line. And then if we've got any dregs like I'm doing now that I've just found, I can use that softened resin to pick out those dregs. Because my resin is self-leveling, I can do this at this stage at 6 hours because the heated resin will just fill its gaps again. I can't do it after 6 hours because the resin is too tacky by then and has really started to cure. So 6 hours is my absolute goal. I have done it at 8 hours and I just find that tape line is a really hard edge. So that's why I like 6 hours, because it's just tacky enough but soft enough. The other important thing that I'm doing now, you'll see I've just popped a bit of cork underneath there, is now I want to tilt my board on a little angle because I don't want that nice straight line, that resin, to flow back down my board. So by tilting it towards the top, prevents any resin flowing backwards, and that's how I get my nice straight lines. And it's so cool because everyone comes up to your markets and they just have to touch your board. So you'll see here there's a silicone mat stuck to my board. So I have spare silicone squares that I can stick on my board so that my boards don't stick to my square razors, so the resin can drip onto my board. So what I do is when I've pulled the board off, I'll go fix up with some fresh resin silicone squares so that I'm not sticking a nice clean board onto wet silicone mats. So now we do the same process again. So we start with the back. I've got a technique. I like to hold my torch in my right hand. So I lightly torch it again because, again, just a very light torch. It's like a couple of seconds at a time. It doesn't really need to be much. And then we're going to lift our tape and we're going to try and peel our tape off in one go. Let's see if we're lucky. Oh, we're looking pretty good here. Oh, we might have it. Oh, almost. Yeah. Woohoo! How good is that? We've got a really nice clean edge there. Just a little bit of resin on the board itself, not on the actual edge, so that's great to know. And now we're going to peel off the edges again. Remember, we just lift the edges because that's the front tape. And we're going to flip our board over and lie it down. A little bit of resin got stuck there apparently. And we're going to do the same process again for the top. So I'm just going to flip her over. We're going to set her down. And we're going to just lightly blowtorch that top part here. Just very lightly, couple of seconds. It's not much at all. And we're going to peel the tape towards the resin. All right, because as I said, we don't want that resin coming towards the board. So we peel it towards the resin, moving with the tape if it's a big piece. And there we've got our beautiful straight board. And we're just going to pop that in our cupboard, our drying rack. And we're going to let that finish curing. And now we don't touch it now for at least 24 hours to allowing that to become nice and dry to touch. Remember, resin has a full cure in about 30 days, but it can be work, like you can move it around in about 48 hours, but you really can't be doing a heck of a lot with it until 30 days. All right, so we've got a couple more boards to do. So you'll see here I've got a couple of silicone mats stuck to my board that's come off the squares that my board was resting on. that's easily fixed. I can just replace that with some clean silicone squares that I've got lying around, and we put these ones to the side to dry. So now we're going to get our blowtorch again, lightly heat up. You'll see here I might burn my tape a little bit. So that's why you've got to be very careful with how long you throw your blowtorch on the tape for. If you do it too long, you're going to end up burning your board. Fortunately, this instance that didn't happen. The tape only went a little bit brown. I was very quick to remove it. This board, I think I ended up having to sand it because it did have a bit of resin stuck to it, but that's okay. So lifting the tape off again, lying it down. We see it's a mess on the tape, and if I didn't have that tape, that's how my board potentially could have looked by the end of my resin. So we've fixed that now. We've got a nice straight line. So that's really cool, really exciting. There are a few dregs, so I've got my art studio is a bit messy. So I've just fixed some dregs up, blowtorch it over, let that self-resin, and there we have another board that I'm just going to put aside and let it cure. So that's pretty easy done. Like, I wish it could only take me 3 seconds to pull the tape off and level it out, but you know, this is the joy of video editing. You can speed your videos up, make them nice and quick. It looks like I've just gone and fixed up a few problems with this particular board as well, with my picking sticks. The good thing about doing it, as I said, at 6 hours is you can go and play with a little bit without ruining the board. And so then this is our last board. Again, blowtorching, making those little resin dots just slightly flowy. Peeling off our tape. That was a great tape pull. That was all done in one nice motion with a little bit of tape left around the hole, which happens quite frequently. So we're going to lift the back tape off in just a second, pop the board down and do our front, and then we're done. And that's really exciting. So that, I hope, has given you all some guidance on how I get my straight lines. Now, other people are going to have their own ways of doing it, but this is just my thing. I find this works really, really well for me, and that's really cool. But you might, if you've got other ideas, absolutely go for it. I'm not a massive resin person, but I really love the way resin looks. And for things like your coasters and your cheese boards and my wine caddies, resin I find is really important because of the usage that they get with them. Whereas if you use like a spray, Rust-Oleum or an engine enamel or enamel sprays that I hear that people using, A, not all of them are food safe. That's just my cat playing in the background. And B, they don't have the longevity that resin does. And the look, I just feel resin makes your products, especially your pigments, pop. So that's why I go through all the trouble of using resin. So as per usual with all my videos, if you've liked them, please like, please subscribe, please add any comments or questions. I will absolutely answer them. And I hope this has inspired you to try using resin and getting some straight lines. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Have an absolutely happy and safe New Year and bring on 2024.